and turn to Mark chapter 14 this morning. Last week was an interesting text, Mark chapter 13, the Olivet Discourse, and I'd encourage you to go back and look at that if you have not, or if you were not here last week. If you've not been here the past several weeks, we are in the series over the book of Mark, and we've been walking all the way from January the 7th, and we're going to conclude this series on Easter or Resurrection Sunday, and moving all through the 16 chapters of Mark. And so this morning, we come to what we might call the beginning of the Passion story, or the Passion narrative. Now, if you've seen the movie The Passion of the Christ, you know that that is the story of Jesus' death. And so we're walking through that story. We're going to walk through it today. We're going to pick up and finish next week with the crucifixion. As we move into this story in Mark chapter 14, Jesus knows that his death is on the horizon. He knows that his death and his resurrection will mean salvation for many. And so he is on mission to do what he's come to do. Now again, the story doesn't begin at the cross. Really, it backs up a little bit, and we're going to cover a few events that lead us up to the cross this morning. But before we dive into the story, I want to put this quote from William Lane's commentary on the book of Mark. I'll put this quote here on the screen. It says this: "In the Gospel of Mark, the Passion narrative or story serves to sharpen the perspective from which all of the incidents in Jesus' life and ministry are to be understood." Now think about that for a minute. What he's saying here is that all we've covered so far, every miracle, every healing, every conversation has been pointing to this story. So this is where we pick up here in Mark chapter 14. Now, we know as we've been walking through the story of Mark, we've seen Jesus in terms of having conversation with religious leaders over and over again, and we know they're not very happy with Jesus. We know that he pushed all the right buttons to tick them off, right? And we read back in chapter 3, verse 6, "Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus." So we know throughout this story that the religious leaders are ready to kill Jesus. They've been talking about this for a long time. And here in chapter 14, we pick up that they have developed that plan. Look at verse 1 with me. "Now the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread were only 2 days away. And the chief priests and the teachers of the law were scheming to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him. But not during the festival, they said, or people may riot." So we understand now, all of these chapters later, they've developed their plan and they're ready to carry out their plan. Now, the city of Jerusalem, as we've been talking about, Jesus has been moving toward the city of Jerusalem. He's been walking toward the city of Jerusalem. That's where it all takes place. That's where the Passover and the Feast of the Unleavened Bread takes place. Now, scholars tell us that the city of Jerusalem would swell in population from about 50,000 people to nearly 250,000 people during these celebrations. Now, you think McGalliard is bad when the students come back to Ball State, right? I mean, this is really, the city is full. And riots were a problem during those days because the city was overcrowded. And so the religious leaders didn't want to have a riot. They didn't want to tick the Romans off. And so they're plotting to kill Jesus, and they've got a plan to do this that will not involve a riot. So Mark begins the story by offering the background scene, and then he shifts to Jesus here. Verse 3. "While he was in Bethany," Bethany's about 2 miles away from Jerusalem, so very close to the city here, "reclining at a table in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head." Now, you've heard this story before, right? He's in the home of this guy named Simon the leper. Now, interestingly enough, you might go, well, is he a leper? Well, he's not a leper anymore because he wouldn't be living there. But he's evidently this fairly prestigious person in the city of Jerusalem. Everybody would have known where his house was. And so this is the house where he's been. Maybe even he was healed by Jesus, but he retains the name the leper because that's what he used to be. We're not exactly sure. John gives us more detail in John chapter 12. Now, we won't be referencing that this morning because we're just going to move through the story with Mark this morning. Mark doesn't even give us the name of the woman here, but we do have her name in other accounts. He simply says that a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume. She breaks the jar and pours it over Jesus' head. Now, we know from research that this substance called nard was a very expensive perfume from India, and that's very likely what was in the alabaster jar. In fact, they would take this nard, very expensive perfume from India, and they would put it in these alabaster jars to seal it so that the perfume would retain its smell, its fragrance. And you could not just unscrew the cap and use a little bit of perfume. If you were going to open the perfume, you would be required to break the seal, break the jar, and then utilize the perfume. And that's exactly what she does there. Look at verse 4. Some of those who were present were saying indignantly to one another, Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages. That's a lot of money, right? That's a lot of perfume, or very expensive perfume. And the money given to the poor. And they rebuked her harshly. Now, let's don't be too judgmental on them yet, okay? Because we understand that the Passover celebration is much like our Christmas season, in that it was expected that people would give to the poor during the Passover. You know how it is at Christmas time? Everybody thinks about giving to the Salvation Army or helping out a needy family. That's kind of what happens at Christmas. That's what would happen at Passover. So maybe their best intentions were, we could have taken this money and we could have used it during the Passover season, and we could have helped somebody who was poor. But Jesus has a different focus, doesn't he? He knows what's going on. He knows what's going to happen. He knows he's going to be killed. And Jesus uses this act of faith, this act of sacrifice on the part of this woman to point to what he has come to do. Now again, everybody there, they don't get it. They don't understand what Jesus is doing here. But look at how Jesus responds in verse 6. "Leave her alone," said Jesus. "Why are you bothering her? She's done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you. And you can help them anytime you want. But you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial." You see, Jesus is pointing to a different place. "Truly I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." Again, Jesus knows what's happening. I'm not sure that the woman fully understood what she was doing. I don't think that she knew that she was preparing Jesus for burial, but the Holy Spirit was working in her, and he prompted her to break this perfume. I think that she's doing it because she appreciates Jesus. She loves him. For all that he's done for her, she wants to honor him. And so she breaks this bottle of perfume. Perhaps it was a family heirloom, right? Perhaps it was something that had been passed down through her family for generations. It had incredible value to it, but she sacrifices it for Jesus. And Jesus said her story would be told, and here we are telling her story 2,000 years later. His prediction is true. Now, the story of the dinner party at Simon the leper's house is also the place where Judas is identified for who he truly is. You ever been watching a movie and everything's kind of happening in the movie, and then you get this behind-the-scenes kind of look? You get to see what all the characters in the movie cannot see. That's what's going on here. And so Mark fills us in. Look at verse 10. "Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money. So he watched for an opportunity to hand him over." I think Mark is contrasting for us these two people. We have the woman on the one hand who has broken her perfume, who has extravagantly sacrificed for Jesus, and then we have Judas on the other hand. Now think about this for a moment. Judas has been with Jesus the whole time. He's been walking around with the other disciples. He's seen Jesus heal. He's heard Jesus' sermons. He knows Jesus. And yet, instead of sacrificing for Jesus, he's using Jesus as an opportunity to earn money. There's all sorts of questions about Judas, isn't there? How many of you have thought about Judas and have asked the question, why did he do it, right? Why did Jesus choose him to be a disciple. Did Jesus know that he was going to do what he did? I mean, there's all sorts of questions about Judas, right? And we won't answer the questions this morning because Mark really doesn't give us answers. He just tells us what happened here. He doesn't give us a motive or any other information. He simply states that Judas made a deal with the religious leaders. They promised him money. He said, I'll turn Jesus over to you. I'll identify him for you. Again, Mark is fairly brief in his details here, but he wants us to hear the story. He wants us to know this is a key part of the story. The religious leaders are ready to kill Jesus, and Judas is in on the plot. Let's keep going in the story. The scene then fades to the Passover meal, and the Passover meal had to be consumed within the city of Jerusalem. So they're in Bethany, which is 2 miles out. They couldn't do Passover there because it's not in Jerusalem. So they got to move to Jerusalem. And look at verse 12. On the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb, Jesus' disciples asked him, where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to eat the Passover? In other words, we know it's time to celebrate it. We don't have a place reserved. We don't have a reservation. What are we going to do? Now, Jesus has it all planned out. Look at verse 13. So he sent 2 of his disciples, telling them, go into the city. A man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. Say to the owner of the house as he enters, the teacher asks, where is my guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? He'll show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready. Make preparations for us there. I think it's interesting just how it all works out. And Jesus tells them exactly what's going to happen. They go in faith and they see exactly what Jesus said would happen. Look what it says in verse 16. The disciples left, went into the city, and what they do? They found things just as Jesus had told them. So they prepared the Passover. As we read these verses, we see Jesus as totally in control, don't we? He knows what's going on. He knows how it's all going to work out. He seems to have everything planned out. Jesus is Lord of all of these events. I think that's what we get from Mark here. He's in complete control. Now, the Passover meal would begin at sunset, and as you might know, on a Jewish calendar, days begin not at sunrise, or early hours begin in the middle of the night, don't they? But days would begin at sunset. So as soon as the sun would go down, it would be a new day, and it would be time for the Passover meal to begin. Now, the meal would begin, and it was a long meal. It would last from sunset all the way until midnight. That's a long meal. At the very beginning of the meal, Jesus lets them know that there's a betrayer among them. Look at verse 17. When evening came, Jesus arrived with the 12. While they were reclining at the table eating, he said, truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me. Now, look back at the Psalms. I want to put Psalm 41 on the screen here because I want you to see how Jesus is really fulfilling all that is written. Jesus, it says in Psalm 41:9, again, written hundreds of years before Jesus, even my close friend, someone whom I trusted, one who shared my bread, see that there, has turned against me. But disciples respond, they were saddened, and one by one they said to him, surely you don't mean me. I mean, can you imagine the tension in the room that night? They're about to begin Passover. It's a solemn ceremony. And Jesus informs them, one of you is going to betray me. And they're going around the room. It's not me, is it? Certainly not me. Surely not I. And I just have to wonder, I don't know about you, and Mark doesn't really tell us, but what do you think happened when it came to Judas? Do you envision Jesus' eyes maybe meeting Judas's eyes? They both know what's going on. And again, Mark doesn't tell us this, but I almost envision Jesus speaking these words as he looks at Judas, verse 20. It is one of the 12, he replied, one who dips bread into the bowl with me. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him, but woe to the man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born. Can't you feel the tension here in the text? Jesus seems to move on in the meal here. The events of the first Passover were recited. Everyone would remember how God provided a Passover lamb for each family. They recall the story. You remember the story back in Exodus? They would take the blood of the lamb and they would paint it on the doorpost, and it would be salvation for that family. The death angel would pass over. And the meal would be like a worship service. Has anybody here ever participated in a Passover meal? We did this one time when I was in Springfield. And walked through all the elements. It's a pretty intense sort of celebration. The head of the house would begin by pronouncing a blessing for the festival. And then they would consume their first glass of wine before the food would be brought in. Every part of the meal has meaning. The unleavened bread, the bitter herbs, the greens, the stewed fruit, the roast lambs. And the son would ask, why is this night so special? And then the family would recall the story of the Passover. This is what Jesus is doing with his disciples. They'd sing a song. Everyone would then enjoy a second cup of wine. Then the head of the house would break the bread. He would distribute it. Then they would consume the bread along with the bitter herbs, the stewed fruit. And then the meal would begin with the eating of roast lamb. The meal would not extend past midnight. It needed to end before midnight. And when the meal finished, the head of the household would bless the third cup of wine. And then there would be singing. And then another part of the worship service. And then there'd be a final and fourth cup of wine. And then the meal would conclude. As we read Mark, we need to understand how the Passover meal works. It's not a meal like we often think. You know, you sit down for 30 minutes and you eat some food and then you go about your way. That's not how it was. It was a long, thought-out worship service, really, with all of the different pieces of the meal. Let's look together at verse 22. While they were eating, Jesus took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples. And Jesus adds this into the Passover meal. Take it. This is my body. He took a cup. When he had given thanks, he gave it to them. And they all drank from it. This is the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. He said to them, truly I tell you, I'll not drink again from the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God. When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. You see, Jesus is redefining Passover. Jesus is saying, I'm the one who's going to be the blood on the doorpost for you. It's a fascinating ceremony, and as we think about this ceremony, it's interesting to look at the Psalms that are in the ceremony that would have been read that evening, and Jesus is really fulfilling the Psalms. I'd encourage you, if you have time, and we don't have time to cover it this morning, but if you want to make a note of Psalm 118, that's a psalm that you can go home and read, especially during Holy Week, as you think about what Jesus did. This is the psalm that would have been the closing hymn of the Passover celebration, and as they leave, they're singing this psalm, and Jesus understanding that he really is the fulfillment of that psalm. They leave the meal, they head out to the Mount of Olives. The story continues here as we will move fairly quickly through the story this morning. I want to tell you, I could stop and we could do a whole sermon on each part of this story, but I want to move through the whole story, so we're going to keep going this morning. The next few verses deal with Peter's denial. And it's almost as if Mark just inserts this story right in the middle of the narrative, but it's an important part of the story. Jesus is talking to all of the disciples here in verse 27. You will all fall away, Jesus told them. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd of the sheep, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have risen, I'll go ahead of you into Galilee. Why does Jesus tell them this? Why would Jesus say, you're all going to bail on me? You see, I think the key point is he wants them to know, you're going to fail me here, but after I've risen, I'm going to meet you again, okay? It's not going to be over. You don't have to run away and forget this thing. You don't have to feel like a failure your whole life, because I'm going to meet you after the resurrection. As we're going to talk about after Easter, we're going to go in this series where we're going to talk about, for between Easter and Pentecost, we're going to recall all of the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. And we're going to see Jesus going to the disciples and restoring them and letting them know that they're still valued, and it's okay. Even though they failed him, he's still with them. And I think that's why Jesus tells them this to begin with. Jesus is not going to give up on them. But look at what Peter says, verse 29. Peter declared, even if all fall away, I will not. He's always the one, isn't he, to speak up first? He's always the one kind of out front there. Jesus quickly sets him straight. Look at verse 30. Truly I tell you, Jesus answered, today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. Jesus is very specific here, isn't he? He said, Peter, calm down, dude. You're going to disown me. In fact, you're going to do it. You're going to do it 3 times, and you're going to do it before the rooster crows twice. He told him it's going to happen tonight. Peter's right back at him, verse 31. But Peter insisted emphatically, even if I have to die with you, I'll never disown you. And all the others said the same. Yeah, we're in too. We won't let this happen to you, Jesus. I don't know what you're talking about. Let's keep going in the story. They head out to this place called Gethsemane, verse 32. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death, he said to them. Stay here and keep watch. Jesus knows what's going to happen. He tells his friends, look guys, I'm struggling here. I'm overwhelmed to the point of death. And then he says, could you guys just stay here? Pray for me. Keep watch. Going a little further, verse 35, he fell to the ground and prayed that if possible, the hour might pass from him. Abba, and Abba is the word that means daddy. Daddy, Father. He said, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. It's a fascinating prayer, isn't it? I mean, Jesus has been telling his disciples the whole time, I'm going to die, and I'm going to rise again. So Jesus knows how it's supposed to work out. But yet, when he gets to the point of it all, it overwhelms him. You know, often we picture Jesus as kind of stone-faced, emotionless, right? Just kind of walking through the motions. Not at all. Jesus is very human. And he feels the same way that you and I would feel if we were going to be crucified. He feels the same terror. He wants it to be another way. He says, Daddy, Father, if there's any other way that this could happen, would you take this cup from me? Taking a cup is often understood in the Old Testament as suffering. And when you would drink a cup, it meant that you were suffering. And Jesus says, if there's any way, Father, again, Daddy, he calls him, Abba, could you take the cup from me? And yet, he ends the prayer. Look at verse 36. Yet not what I will, but what you will. Ultimately, Jesus submits to the Father. He knows what he must do, and he knows how he must do it. Mark wants us to know, though, this isn't easy for Jesus. Again, he's very human, and he's struggling the whole time. Verse 37, then he returned to his disciples and found them, what? Sleeping. Simon, he said to Peter, are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Mark doesn't say it here, but I picture Jesus saying, yeah, you said you would never abandon me or fail me, and now you can't even stay awake while I'm praying this prayer. They wanted to be strong, but they just didn't have it in them. Look at verse 40. Once more he went away and prayed the same thing. When he came back, he found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. They did not know what to say to him. Goes back, prays again. Jesus again is in anguish, pleading with the Father. He needs his closest companions, his friends, to support him. But all they can do is sleep, Mark tells us. What a picture of fallen humanity. I don't know, sometimes we read this and we might say, well, why can't they just stay awake? I would stay awake, you might say. No, you wouldn't. You'd be sleeping just like them. We all would, because we all are weak. And it's the middle of the night, and they're tired. And they've had the Passover meal. Their tummies are full. They've had 4 cups of wine, right? And they are tired. They're sleeping. If we admit it, we're all like them. And again, Jesus says, you want to be strong, but the flesh is weak. Now, you would think after 2 times of this that the third time they would be able to stay awake. But look at verse 41. Returning the third time, he said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? Enough! The hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. How many exclamation marks do you see in the text there? Jesus is emphatic, isn't he? I almost picture him a little bit frustrated here. Can't you guys stay awake? Okay, it's time. 3 times. He clearly tells them the time is now. The hour has come. Get up. Let's go. Mark is quick with the description here. Look at verse 43. Just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. With him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs sent from the chief priests and the teachers of the law and the elders. Jesus can hardly get the words out of his mouth, and you just hear the mob coming with Judas. Mark fills us in on how it all worked out. Look at verse 44 now. The betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, Rabbi, and kissed him. Betrayed with a kiss. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Now Peter decides to do something. Verse 47, then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Now, we know from John that this is Peter, but Mark doesn't even mention his name, does he? Mark just says one of the guys did this. Then Jesus questions why they are arresting him in this manner. Verse 48, am I leading a rebellion, said Jesus, that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you, teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me. But the scriptures must be fulfilled. Then everyone deserted him and fled. They did just what he said they would do. They said they would not abandon him, but when the guards showed up, they did. Now, verses 51 and 52 are interesting. And before we read them, it's worth noting here that verses 51 and 52, that this little segment here is only found in Mark. It's not in any of the other Gospels. Look at 51. A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. How many of you remember that? You're like, what? Is that in there? There's been a good deal of debate about who is the naked man running around here. And I don't have time to get into it this morning. We don't really know is the answer. But let me encourage you, if you have some time this week, here's your homework. Go home and Google this and see if you can find out who this guy is. Now, some believe maybe it's John. They're not sure exactly who it is. But the point is that this man tries to follow Jesus, and he ends up running away too. But it's interesting. I think I just pointed that out without getting too deep there. Now, as we are walking through the story, I'll stick with Mark's account here and just keep reading the story. I want to make sure we have time to get through it all this morning. Verse 53. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law came together. Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. So he's there, trying to track with Jesus. There he sat on the guard with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. Chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. So then some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, I'll destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days we'll build another, not made with hands. Yet even their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, are you not going to answer? what is this testimony these men are bringing against you? But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus. "And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his clothes. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You've heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, "Prophesy." And the guards took him and beat him. Jesus is silent. He just seems to take it all. But notice when Jesus speaks in the text. When does he speak? He speaks when the high priest asks him a question, "Are you the Messiah?" What did Mark tell us that he was writing about back in the very first chapter? If you open up to Mark chapter 1, verse 1, Mark says, I'm writing this to tell you that Jesus is the what? Messiah. And here at the trial, Jesus stands there. He takes it all. He doesn't say a word until they ask him, "Are you the Messiah?" And he says, "I am." He speaks up. He's the Messiah. That's what Mark wants us to see. He wants us to know he is the one who has come to save his people from their sins. When he says this, they tear their clothes. They began to spit on him and blindfold him and beat him. Then Mark details Peter's denial here. Remember, Peter had vehemently disagreed with Jesus. "I will never let this happen to you," Peter says. "I'll die with you if I have to." And then look at what it says in verse 66. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. "You also were with the Nazarene Jesus," she said. But he denied it, number one. I don't know or understand what you're talking about," he said, and went into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, "This fellow is one of them." Again, he denied it. Number two, after a little while, those standing near him said, "Peter, surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." He began to call down curses and swore to them, "I don't know this man you're talking about." 3 times. Immediately the rooster crowed a second time. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him, "Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. Let's keep going in the story. Mark chapter 15, verse 1. Very early in the morning, the chief priest with the elders and the teachers of the law and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "You've said so," Jesus replied.